There are 206 bones in the adult skeleton, and with the exception of one bone called the hyoid bone, all of the other bones in the body are connected to another bone in the body. And so you have a lot of joints in your body, and a joint is just anywhere where two or more bones come together. We can also call a joint an articulation. Now we can classify joints by how the bones are connected to each other. So we have three different structural classifications of joints, and they include fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. So let's start by taking a look at fibrous joints. So fibrous joints are where two or more bones are connected to each other by fibrous connective tissue. So a really common example are sutures, which are these joints that are found in between the bones in the skull. So we typically think of the skull as being a fairly solid structure, and a lot of people think it's just made up of one bone. But in reality, you have the frontal bone here, you've got the parietal bone, the occipital bone, temporal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, etc., etc. So you actually have several different bones that make up the skull, and those bones are connected by these very strong joints called sutures. Now, if you've ever heard of a baby having a soft spot when they're first born, so in small babies and small children, the soft spot is just where these sutures haven't formed yet. And that's because during birth, the skull bones actually get kind of pushed together in order for the head to fit out through the pelvis and the mother's birth canal. And so those sutures aren't formed so that the bones can actually kind of squish together a little bit. But through or after birth and then throughout childhood development, those sutures start to form and those soft spots close up. Cartilaginous joints are just where the bones in a joint are connected by a type of cartilage. So some common examples are the discs that are found in between the vertebrae in your vertebral column. So these are two vertebrae here, and you've got this kind of squishy intervertebral disc here. Now, if you've ever heard of a slipped disc or a bulging disc, it's this kind of structure of cartilage that can sometimes lose its shape, and it can push on nerves that are coming out of the kind of the space here, and that causes the pain associated with a bulging disc or a slipped disc. The pubic symphysis is another cartilaginous joint, and so this is the pelvis right here. You've got two coxa bones, so you've got one here and one here, and they come together in the front at the pubic symphysis. Now, both of these joints aren't super flexible, but they do allow for a little bit of movement. And so the pubic symphysis, for example, during childbirth, it can relax a little bit to help to open up the pelvis a bit to help the baby's head fit through the pelvis. And then the flexibility of all these different intervertebral discs between all of the different vertebrae allows you the flexibility to move your spine in different ways. And then the most common type of joint that you're probably the most familiar with are called synovial joints. And these are joints in which the bones are connected by a joint cavity. So the bones themselves don't actually touch each other. There's a little bit of space filled with fluid in between them. So some examples are your knees, elbows, hips, and shoulders. So you can see here, this is kind of a generic example of a synovial joint. So let's pretend like this is the femur and this is the tibia. So notice how the edges of the bones, they each have articular cartilage for protection, but they're also not touching each other. There is this kind of fibrous capsule that is surrounding this joint. And within that fibrous capsule is synovial fluid. And that synovial fluid acts like a shock absorber, and it also helps to lubricate the joint so that the bones aren't rubbing against each other and causing friction and wear and tear. So let's take a look at some of the more specific structures associated with this synovial joint here. So the articular capsule is made of fibrous connective tissue, and it just forms the outer walls of the joint cavity. On the inside of the articular capsule is the synovial membrane. And the synovial membrane is the structure that actually produces that synovial fluid. And as we mentioned, that synovial fluid, it just helps to lubricate and cushion the joint so that the bones aren't hitting against each other and causing friction and wear and tear. In the articular cartilage, this was a leftover remnant from endochondral ossification. It covers the epiphysis of each bone that makes up the joint, and it has a protective function. It helps to absorb shock whenever these two bones might touch. It also helps to take some of the friction or wear and tear so that the bone tissue itself doesn't get worn down.